Χριστός Christi. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Canadian Orthodox Monastery of All Saints of North America and to the Shrine of the Theotokos Joy of Canada. I said last week that we talk a little bit about culture wars. We need first of all look a little bit at the history of the culture wars. But first I want to round out a little bit of what I said last week about the book of Genesis. Because the book of Genesis, we say it's not historically accurate, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be because it teaches us so much in its story. In the first place, of course, it totally displaces all of the pagan creation myths of the Middle East and perhaps other places in the world, by telling us that God, the only God, created man in his own likeness and image, which is completely unlike the other creation myths where a bevy of gods created man as a slave, labor. What God gives mankind in his own likeness and image is responsibilities, not slave labor, but responsibilities, making it clear to us that man does have responsibilities, that he's not an automaton, that he's not a robot, but has a free will in order to fill responsibilities, and not sort of hardwired to be a slave to a bunch of gods, but also that he demonstrates to us that he does have free will and he has choice. He has the love of God, and love without freedom is a fraud. To demand love without freedom is a psychosis. To give love without freedom is an obsession. But in either case, it's not love. Man fails in his responsibilities. He accepts a counterfeit for what God has already given him. He's the image and likeness of God, but Satan says, you can become like God. Exactly. So here's a counterfeit that Satan is offering of something that God has already given. That's a great revelation to us. But how does Satan lead man into alienation from God? Through ego. The birth of human ego is being unfolded in the story, and we're being told that ego is at the source and root of all of man's problems. And that's all I'm going to say now about the book of Genesis, but I want it clear that this is an allegory that's full of revelation, divine revelation, and it tells us so much about the human nature in a short, well-written story. So we should never be tempted to dismiss it because it's not historically or scientifically accurate. That's not what it's all about. It's about the revelation of human nature and human weakness. And about, God's still protective love. We'll discuss that a little later. Remembering that after Cain commits a murder, God doesn't destroy him, but God rather entreats Cain to repent. And when he doesn't repent, he gives him a mark to protect him, so that he still has time to repent. So that's setting our relationship with God and with ourselves in a proper perspective. Now, we're going to talk about culture wars, and I want to look back in history a little bit, because culture wars are certainly nothing new. Every time a society or culture makes an advance or a change, and it's inevitable. Change is inevitable. The only alternative to change is death. What doesn't change dies and rots. That includes our attitudes, our mental conditions, even sometimes our doctrines and dogmas that we form in an age where less is known, and when more becomes known, If we don't change, we're simply left in the dust of history, like some kind of pile of rubble somewhere. Change is inevitable. Growth is not. Change is inevitable. Becoming educated is not. Change is inevitable. Being able to cope with change, being able to cope with reality is not inevitable. That's where our problem lies as human beings. When Rome tried to form one world government, it wasn't the first one. The Persians tried it, the Greeks tried it. Everyone wanted one world government. It had to be theirs, and it had to be on the basis of their ideology. Rome formed what we now call a cancel culture because they wanted to make sure that their culture was dominant and everyone else's was canceled. Everyone else's aspirations, everyone else's cultural structure, the things they had as cultural heroes, cultural worship, are all going to be canceled for the peace of Rome. This one world government, each empire, as it grew, wanted to have a reset. They wanted to reset the world's culture to fit their own. And they wanted one central government to control the known world. Partly from fear, but largely from greed. And now we go back to the book of Genesis, to the creation narrative. Greatly from ego. Individual ego, but national ego. National egotism. Cultural egotism. And each time one of these empires built up, in various countries, particularly in Judea, there would be what we call a cultural war. Judea had something to protect. One God, and the structure of life that God had revealed, including keeping the fast and worship in the temple, worship of only one God. And this was sometimes tolerated. The Persians, for instance, were very tolerant. The Seleucid Empire, the empire that was left over when Alexander the Great's empire fell apart, in the Seleucid Empire, Theophany, very often called Theophany the Bad, the emperor was determined to cancel the Judean culture and religion, to put a statue of Zeus in the temple, to defile the temple. This is what the book of Daniel is really all about, pseudo-Daniel, because it is a pseudo-epigraphica, was written mostly about, while it recorded traditions from the Babylonian captivity. It wasn't written during the Babylonian captivity, and it wasn't written by anybody named Daniel. It was written about Daniel. But most of it was written centuries later during the period of the Greek occupation of Judea. And it tells us about the Maccabee martyrs, tells us about the period of the Hasmoneans, and the attempt to withstand the, to put it in modern terms, the cancel culture of the Seleucid Empire. And there was a great cultural war at that time in Judea, trying to preserve something, and yet part of the culture was trying to submit to the Hellenization of their culture. And the culture war went far beyond things that were necessary, because people would get a little bit fanatical and carried away. The Roman Empire came in, and they also gave a lot of latitude to the Judeans. They agreed not to take the pagan symbols of Rome into the city of Jerusalem. They agreed to allow the temple worship. the Jews could follow their own culture and worship so long as they just paid the taxes to Rome and didn't start any trouble. But the Judeans did start a lot of trouble because there was, again, a culture war that was really unnecessary because the Romans allowed the free worship of God. They allowed the free sacrifice in the temple. They allowed the holiness of Jerusalem to be maintained. But the culture war came to violence. And this has gone on throughout history. It went on in the shift from the Victorian era to the Edwardian era, there was a kind of dislocation and a kind of culture war. It grew from that because the First World War was a great dislocation. And after the First World War, you couldn't go back to what had existed before the First World War. It had transformed too much and it had revealed too much. After the First World War, women were going to demand the right to vote. And that was a dislocation in culture and society. It was a great cultural war. I read the newspapers from that era when the men who wrote, and it was men who wrote for the newspapers, called women's demanding a right to vote a great perversion. One of the greatest socially disruptive movements in history, they called it. So, totally unnatural for women to want to vote and to want more freedom. That's what it was called in the newspapers of the day. You could go back and read it yourself. Perversion, totally unnatural, totally disruptive of society, totally destructive of the structure of society for women to want to vote. And God forbid, even run for office. You know, tell that to Queen Elizabeth I and to Margaret Thatcher. So that was one of the great culture wars of the past. The 1920s, we saw extension of this culture war. We saw the tent revival preachers going around the countryside, and we saw prohibition come in. Well, hyper-religious or religious fanatics thought, oh, prohibition is a great moral victory, except that it gave birth to organized crime. And it gave birth to the greatest crime wave in world history. Mostly in America, to some degree in Canada, but lesser. But it created more havoc, displacement, bloodshed, and crime. Well, it wasn't really a great moral victory after all, was it? It was something that crashed the nation into total immorality and made crime syndicates so powerful that even today they maintain that power. Eventually, of course, they had a certain control of the FBI through J. Edgar Hoover, who notably avoided clashes with the crime bosses, with the crime syndicates, more or less allowed them hands off, and went after other things, some of them quite imaginary. The Cold War was another, what we call culture wars. Sometimes devastating, because they always went to extremes. I mean, children being taught to duck under their desks in case there was a nuclear war, as if Hiroshima and Nagasaki haven't proved that ducking under your desk would do absolutely no good. But people were so hysterical about it that they thought, while you're in the school building under your desk, that'll protect you from a nuclear blast. The military-industrial complex became immensely stronger because of the Cold War. And citizens in democratic countries gave up some of their freedoms, hoping for security. Finally, the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union, which was inevitable. We had culture wars because of the dislocations of the end of the Cold War. Well, we're involved now in, some people want to create a culture war where none need exist. Because society changes, as it always changes, as surely as trees turn green in the spring and brown and yellow in the fall, change is inevitable. Without change, there's only death and rot and decay. We continually live in the past, and some people strive to live in the past. I used to hear people talking about, oh, the good old days, the golden age, something. There was no golden age before the invention of antibiotics. I spent my whole childhood in a world without antibiotics, when people could still die from a finger scratch, from blood poisoning, when people still died from simple infections that now are taken for granted. No one remembers that these days. My generation might be the last one who remembers what it was like to live without antibiotics. And the next generation after this one might again have to live without effective antibiotics, and then they'll guess. There was no golden age before antibiotics. When people with tuberculosis were sent away to a sanatorium to die because there was no hope for them. So suddenly penicillin came along, the sanatoriums closed down, and people with tuberculosis went home cured. Thank for science. Thank God for science. Now we're involved in a culture war that seems to keep some preachers away from preaching the gospel. All they can do is preach culture wars, because things are changing and they're reactionaries. For those of you who know Konstantin Pobedonostov, they're Pobedonostov reactionaries. The ones who actually caused the Soviet Revolution in Russia were the reactionaries who couldn't allow or face change, who thought they were involved in a culture war to preserve something that wasn't worth preserving and couldn't possibly be preserved anyway. They're the ones who laid the foundations of the Soviet Revolution. It wasn't a demonic enterprise. It was a revolution against reactionaries who prevented society from moving forward, from changing and advancing, from having social justice for the ordinary people and workers who, in their desperation, changed to the false prophets, Lenin, Kaganosov, Molotov, Malenkov, and finally Stalin, because they had no hope, because reactionaries were fighting the culture wars and keeping change and advance from taking place so that the communist revolution could have been avoided. That's somewhat like is going on now, perhaps to a lesser degree. Instead of preaching the gospel, we want to preach reactionaryism to everything that happens, to everything that's taking place. And you're totally unconvincing to society at large. You watch day by day your culture wars being lost by the reactionaries and won by those who are perhaps too progressive, too permissive, and they're winning the culture wars because you're so reactionary, ignorant, backward, and because you refuse to preach the gospel. The gospel has power where culture wars doesn't. The gospel has power where reactionaryism doesn't. Give the gospel its due, then it does have power. Preach the gospel and stop preaching these absolutely losing culture wars, because when we look back at history, we see that reactionaries against the advancement in society, against new knowledge, real understanding about humanity, the human nature, about the way the world operates, about the way the universe works, about what's taking place in our world and our society. Always reactionaryism, based in nothing else but a deep structural fear. A hyperactive amygdala, perhaps an enlarged amygdala. Fear of change. You might as well be afraid of spring. You might as well be afraid of summer. You might as well be afraid of the autumn and the winter, because change takes place before your very eyes. And you're trying to prevent that change in society and culture, that advancement of knowledge, of understanding, because you can't cope with it because you're reactionary, because your brain is frozen in some kind of suspended animation. And you can't open your eyes and see what's going on around you. So you act against it. You've got this pobedonophitis. You can Google Constantine Pobedonopoulos if you want, and see why he helped destroy the Russian Empire, destroy Imperial Russia, and see why the reactionaries, not the progressives, but the reactionaries, are the ones who ultimately issued in the Soviet Revolution. The progressives, sure, they weakened society because they were intelligentsia, we should say. Weren't really progressives, they were just intelligentsia. But the reactionaries are the ones who laid the foundation for the communist revolution in Russia. And you're laying the foundation for a great dislocation in culture and society because you have a cult of reactionism. A cult, brothers and sisters, a cult. And you need to open your minds and open your souls and trust the gospel. Preach the gospel. Stop preaching revolution of sorts. Stop preaching a kind of emotional and mental violence that has already several times resulted in physical violence and unintended consequences, and in precisely the opposite of what you're raving and howling about. So that's what I have to say today. And remember that Christ has risen. The gospel has power.